Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So it's been a little bit under a day since we got the updated ban list for the Sanctum Showdown, and quite a lot has happened in that short period of time. So today we're going to take a look at some of the best decks to be playing in Sanctum Showdown after the changes that we got yesterday. So here's a quick look at the untapped stats. Mind you, it's still early, people are still messing around with stuff, but I do think it does paint a decent picture of what things are shaping up to be so far in Sanctum after the bans. Unsurprisingly, Zoo is the most popular deck in this mode, and it also appears to be the one doing the best. However, I do think there is going to be some room for counterplay here, and we can see that a little bit with some of the other decks that are popping up. So, who are the dominant meta players in Sanctum Showdown now? Definitely Zoo. Guardians decks probably also fall under there, but I think Zoo is just a little bit more efficient than going all in on the Guardians, though the Guardians are a great budget option, or just a good small package to have. I think a lot of decks can benefit from simply running Star-Lord, Rocket Raccoon, and maybe Gamora. On top of that, we have Move. Move was actually positioned pretty well before the bans, but it did get a nice little boost in the fact that Scream is no longer around to sap away some of their power, and just being able to make one really big thing, move it from lane to lane, get rewarded for doing that with extra points. It just makes a lot of sense for this kind of mode. Surtr also having a surprisingly strong performance, which is not something I was expecting. Its play rate might be pretty small here, but it does have a pretty solid win rate. Now, this is a pretty much untouched version of the deck. We're going to take a look at the decks in a minute here, but this seems to pretty much be the same Surtr deck people played before the nerfs. It just seems to be doing a lot better now with a bunch of the other cards banned out of this format, even though Surtr itself is definitely weaker than it was pre-OTA. Arsham seems to be doing okay as well, not super popular, but does seem viable in the mode. I think a lot of that strength is probably coming from the fact that it is one of the few decks choosing to run a tech card like Shang-Chi, and sometimes Arsham will just high roll and be able to take advantage of that one extra energy starting on turn 3. So I think it's an okay choice for the mode, but I think if you really value consistency, I'd probably still stick away from Arsham for Sanctum. Then we have Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben seems to be doing pretty well. This is kind of like a Zoo style deck, but it is trying to take advantage of the fact that Zoo is the most popular deck, so running a clutch card like Killmonger can be a great way to flip the matchup on its head. So it feels like it's kind of like anti-Zoo, so to speak. Ajax seems to be doing all right as well, as does Agent Venom. High Evo and Patriot are apparently doing okay, not as good as the rest of the decks previously mentioned, but they seem playable. And then the bad decks of the format seem to be Mill, Ongoing, and Destroy. These all just seem a bit too slow to accomplish the kind of things you want to be doing in Sanctum. So that's our general meta overview. Let's take a look at some of the decks in these archetypes. So in the number one spot, we have Zoo. We can see there are a few different variations of these lists here, but they're all pretty similar. As you might expect, Sam Wilson, Captain America, is still doing tremendous amounts of work in this mode, and I think might just be the best card in this mode. I will not be surprised if he ends up getting the axe next time around in Sanctum, but he's the season pass card, so we all knew that was pretty unlikely to happen in the first run, while he is still the season pass card. We have the best performing deck on win rate in the top left, but it is also the one with the lowest sample size, so not surprising to see the higher win rate with the lower sample. Usually as the sample goes up, the win rate will go down a bit, but here we can see even in the bottom right, with almost 2,000 games, Zoo is still averaging almost 60% win rate, which is really, really high. And you can see that one has actually adapted to running Kyera, and I think that is a natural meta development of the Killmonger deck starting to show up a little bit more. But yeah, most of these Zoo decks look pretty similar. Some of them decide to lean on the Guardian stuff. Some of them just go for the traditional Zoo stuff with like Ant-Man and Dazzler. But I don't think you can really go wrong with any of these lists. I am a little surprised that Marvel Boy is still making the cut here, but now that some of the more powerful cards have been removed from the format, I think you can afford to play something like Marvel Boy, where it's a little bit slower on that, first initial turn, but the impact it has throughout the game really starts to add up. But yeah, so far with the early data, Zoo seems to be like the major standout of the decks in this format. Another high performer in this format is Move. The Move deck has been very, very good. I don't really know why Luke Cage is here. I think this may just be an example of, well, the person who is playing this or the people who are playing this were running into a bunch of Ajax, so they decided to throw in Luke as a bit of tech. That can make sense, especially given that most of this deck is cheaper cards, so it's a little bit weaker to things like Man-Thing, which can be especially devastating when paired with Diamondback. Personally, I don't think I'd really recommend Luke Cage in a deck like this. I think you want at least one more big power card, whether that be something like Gamora or a Vision that gives you that little bit of flexibility in moving it about. But the rest of this deck, I think, makes a lot of sense. I played quite a bit of a very similar move deck in Sanctum, and it is really good. Move just has that benefit of being able to make one really big dude. Usually it's Human Torch or Vulture, sometimes it's Dagger, but we have enough big threats and enough ways to move them about the board, to keep them scaling, to keep fighting for the Sanctum, that it's just really good. It's just a really good, solid overall deck. And out of all the best decks in this format right now, I think it's probably the one you will miss Sam Wilson from the least if you don't end up having him. I think you could very easily get away with replacing him with something like Kraven. Not saying it'll be better, but I don't think this particular deck will miss that quite as much as some of the other decks do. So yeah, Move, definitely a really good one to consider. The downside with Move is sometimes you do just get brick hands where you get all your payoffs or you get all your enablers without the other one you need to make the little combo happen. But when you do get things rolling, it can be really, really hard for your opponent to stop. Then we have Surtr. This is one I was really surprised to see doing so well. Obviously, is a little bit of a lower sample size, but Surtr, I think, wasn't actually doing that hot initially. So it's very interesting to see after the bans, even though Surtr and Scar both caught some pretty big hits in the OTA, that the deck seems to be doing very well in Sanctum. And I think I understand why. It's just a lot of power. It's just big numbers, and a lot of the things that people were using to circumvent the big numbers, like a Cannonball or Negasonic, those things are gone. Some of the cards that hated on this archetype effectively, like Scream and Rocket and Groot, those are gone too. So this deck just really benefited from the fact that a lot of the cards that were good against it are no longer in the format. So even though it got nerfed, it still seems to be doing very well. I don't know how much Shang is in the format right now. I don't think it's a lot. It's probably a little bit more than there was before the bans, but I still don't think it is a very popular card. So I would consider actually dropping the armor for something else, because I just don't think you're going to be getting a whole lot of value out of that armor. I think there are a variety of other 2-drops that can probably just do better. Cosmo at least gets some added utility. We don't really have that many on reveals in the deck, and it makes it so that opponents have a harder time getting value off of things like opposing Guardians. So in general, I think the list makes sense, but I think you could probably do a little bit of tweaking here. Drop the armor for another good 2-drop, or even Bob if you have it. I think Bob got a pretty massive boost in this mode because now he no longer has to fear getting shot down by Scream. And then Arrow, I just find that Arrow's not that great in this format personally. So I would recommend swapping her out with maybe a Vision, or if you want to have another big dude for enabling your Scar, you could just jam a Gamora in here as well. I think that would probably do a bit of a better job in filling that 5-drop role than we are currently seeing from Arrow. But in general, I'm pretty surprised to see that the Surtr Scar deck does seem to be doing better post-bans than it did pre-bans, even with the OTA nerf. So if you're a Surtr enjoyer, maybe it's not a bad time to play the deck in the mode. And then we have the Uncle Ben decks. So this is pretty interesting. Uncle Ben, obviously a new card from the mode. Somehow it's the namesake of the deck, even though I think you can very easily play these kind of decks without Uncle Ben. Just jam in another 1-drop. But yeah, these are, I think, trying to capitalize on the fact that Zoo is the most popular deck. They spam out a bunch of 1-drops. Well, these decks can spam out a bunch of 1-drops too, but they blow them up with Killmonger to get a cheap death. They have Squirrel Girl, Bucky, the Shield for enabling a cheaper Mockingbird. But I think they're really seeing a lot of benefit from the fact that they're just able to very efficiently run Killmonger and have death as a big payoff for that Killmonger. They do have decent ways of getting some points on the board. Angel is kind of Makari at home now that Makari has been banned, being able to destroy something and then get essentially a 0-3. Pretty good way of seizing tempo in the mode. Mockingbird and Death are your big stat sticks. Gladiator is still a decent option there as well for just a high value 3-drop that gets points on the board. We can see they've gone in some different directions here. The one on the right opting to run Shang for a little bit of control versus some of the decks that go higher than them, as well as Shauna to get more of a board presence if you aren't finding that Squirrel Girl. The other two are leaning more into the destroy theme, so they're running things like Bucky and Carnage and Venom, so more ways to destroy their cards, get value out of the things like Uncle Ben, Bucky Barnes, X-23, and more consistently enable that free Angel. So I do think if Zoo ends up staying the most popular deck of the format, I think you're going to see a rise in these destroy tempo decks featuring Uncle Ben, and you might see them adapt even further to pack more tech to effectively shut Zoo decks down. But yeah, they definitely seem like a very viable option right now. But what about some decks that weren't really featured on the general Untapped data? So these come from Cam Best's Discord. I saw them posted in there, and I really like the look of these two decks. I believe these were from Hanafire and Koopa Troop. And they're really interesting builds for the format. The one on the left is a War Machine style deck. So you have much bigger threats than most opponents are going to be able to have in this format. Vision has proved to be quite good after the bans. I do think you could also experiment with something like a Luna Snow or maybe an Electro here to ramp out some of your bigger threats. That's an option. Or even a Jubilee as another pseudo ramp piece. But this deck kind of splits it down the middle with having a bunch of high value early game cards and then some pretty heavy hitters for the late game. War Machine being able to slam out that Infinite and the Ebony Maw, very strong. Cull, still one of the best 4-drops in the format. Vision gives you that added flexibility, and Red Hulk can be surprisingly strong too, because there are a lot of situations where your opponents end up floating in energy, so he just gets so large that it can be very hard for your opponent to contest a Red Hulk lane. And then the other deck's really cool. It's taking advantage of the newly buffed Werewolf by Night. Werewolf finally back to its original 3/3 form, and given the fact that there are a lot of strong on-reveal cards in this mode, having the Werewolf bounce around the board and get benefit for doing so seems like a pretty strong thing to be doing. This does include one of the cards you get from the mode Laufey. I think Laufey's an interesting include here, but I think it can also be replaced pretty easily by a budget substitution, just another good 4-drop that is either high stats or a good on reveal. You could even jam another Guardian like Drax into this spot if you really wanted to, I think, and it wouldn't really affect things too much. But yeah, we have the basic Guardians game plan. We have some of the more high value 2-drops in Iron Patriot and Sam Wilson. We have Werewolf to move around the board and get stats, so we can fight for the Sanctum with the same card multiple times. Strange to move around to some of our bigger threats like the Laufey or a Gamora. And then Copycat. Copycat's still just a very strong 3-drop in this mode since it's guaranteed premium stats. And given a lot of the cards people are running in this mode, it often has a premium effect on top of that. So yeah, if you're looking for something a little bit different, I think these are two interesting ways to go that both seem to have done fairly well in the format so far. And to close things out here, I did want to include one budget option if you're a new player, or a low CL player, or maybe a returning player who's missing a lot of cards. I think making this kind of budget Guardian Zoo style deck is probably the way to go. You could add Shauna in here as well in place of Elsa. I opted to go for a small Elsa package, so we have Angela, Kitty, Nightcrawler. These let you kind of stack up a lane, get the Elsa buffs, and then let you move that power into a different lane to fight for this different Sanctum with the same strong cards. So I think that's a pretty good way to go about it. We have Miles and Spider-Man just because they're decent stat sticks, and occasionally you can use Spider-Man to just yoink out an opponent's card to surprise win the Sanctum. The Guardians are good in this mode. Vision's flexible. Pretty straightforward deck. I know there are a lot of people out there who are newer to the game and are just trying to make things work. I think this is probably a pretty good starting build if you really don't have access to many cards. And then you can naturally upgrade this depending on what cards you might have. If you have Sam Wilson, put him in this deck. If you have Mockingbird, jam in Shauna and Squirrel Girl. It's one of those decks where this is just supposed to be a pretty simple baseline with all pool 3 or lower cards, so it gives you, that starting foundation, and then you can adapt to that with whatever you have in your collection. But I think this isn't a bad way to go if you want to be on a very strict budget. And that's going to wrap it up for our updated best decks for the Sanctum Showdown. Let me know what you have been experiencing in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. Have you been liking Sanctum post bans? Have you not really been liking it? I think in general, what I've seen is people seem to have been enjoying it a bit more than pre-patch, and I do think there is a little bit more of ways to kind of adapt to the meta and try and counter some opposing strategies now that were much harder to do before. Namely, going after like the zoo with the Killmonger stuff. I think we'll see some more developments there. I think Sam Wilson is almost certainly still too strong and should be banned, but unfortunately it seems unlikely that's going to happen this time around. But let me know what your experience has been, what decks have been working for you, what haven't, how far in the mode are you, what have you got from it, what are you aiming for? I'd love to hear it. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.